The USS Dakota moved slowly through the dark void of space. It was a gray ship, built for hard work and long journeys, not for showing off. There were no shiny gold plates or fancy lights on the outside. It looked like a tool, sturdy and reliable. Inside the bridge, Commander Paul Evans stood with his hands behind his back. He watched the main screen as a large planet came into view. It was covered in bright lights and tall spires that reached up toward the stars. This was the home world of the KRYLL Empire, the leaders of the Galactic Council. Humanity had waited a long time for this day. They were finally invited to join the group of advanced species that ruled the galaxy. Paul turned to look at his team. Ambassador Linda Moore was checking her datapad one last time. She wore a formal blue suit that looked sharp against the gray walls of the ship. She was nervous, but she hid it well. Beside her stood Jason Clark, a young aide who held a briefcase tightly. Jason was new to this kind of work, and his eyes were wide with wonder. Paul spoke softly to them. He told them to stay calm and to remember why they were here. This was not just a party. It was a test. If humans failed this test, they would be left alone in the dark again. Paul knew that humanity could survive alone, but joining the Council meant trade, technology, and peace. It was worth the trouble. The ship began its descent toward the planet. The shaking was slight as the engines fought against gravity. Through the windows they could see the capital city. It was massive. Buildings floated in the air, held up by invisible forces. Rivers of light moved between the towers like traffic. It was beautiful, but it felt cold. There were no trees or parks visible, only metal and glass. The USS Dakota landed on a large platform made of white stone. The engines powered down, and the silence returned. Paul took a deep breath. He adjusted his uniform jacket. It was a simple dark green color, very different from the colorful robes the aliens usually wore. He did not care about fashion. He cared about respect. The airlock hissed open, and a ramp extended down to the platform. A group of aliens waited for them. They were tall and thin, with skin that shimmered like silver. These were the KRL. They stood in perfect lines, not moving a muscle. Paul walked down the ramp first, followed by Linda and Jason. Their boots made loud sounds on the stone floor. The aliens did not blink. They just watched the humans approach. Paul stopped a few feet away from the leader of the group. He waited for them to speak first. It was a sign of respect, but also a test of patience. A figure stepped forward from the line. It was a female KRL, taller than the rest. She wore a robe of deep purple with gold patterns. This was Princess Vea, the daughter of the Emperor. She looked down at Paul with eyes that had no warmth. She did not smile. She looked at humans the way a person looks at a stray dog. She began to speak, and her voice was translated by the devices on their collars. She welcomed them to the Empire, but her words were sharp. She called humanity young and unstable. She said that the Council was here to guide them because they could not guide themselves. Linda Moore tightened her grip on her datapad, but she said nothing. Paul kept his face smooth like stone. Princess Vea walked around Paul, inspecting him. She touched the fabric of his uniform with a long finger, as if checking for dirt. She asked him if he was afraid. She said that many species came here and never left because they could not handle the truth of the galaxy. Paul looked her in the eye. He told her that humans were not afraid of the truth. They were only afraid of wasting time. The princess laughed, a sound like breaking glass. She turned and gestured for them to follow. The KRYLL guards turned in unison and began to walk toward a massive building in the distance. It was the Great Hall, where the Council met. Paul signaled for Linda and Jason to follow him. They walked through the city streets. Other aliens watched them from the sidelines. Some whispered behind their hands. Others just stared with curiosity. Humans were a rare sight here. Most species thought humans were too violent to be allowed in polite society. Paul ignored the stares. He focused on the path ahead. He knew that the real challenge was waiting inside the Great Hall. The princess wanted to humiliate them before the other leaders. She wanted to show that humans were children who needed a babysitter. Paul knew he had to prove her wrong without losing his temper. He thought about the history of his people. He thought about the fights they had won against impossible odds. He was ready. The large doors of the great hall opened slowly, revealing a room filled with light and hundreds of alien faces. Paul stepped across the threshold, ready to face the galaxy. The great hall was even larger than it looked from the outside. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into a soft glow. There were no lights visible, only a general brightness that came from the walls themselves. The floor was made of a smooth black material that reflected the faces of everyone standing on it. Hundreds of aliens filled the space. Some sat on floating chairs, while others stood on platforms that matched their height. The air smelled like ozone and strange spices. It was a mix of scents that Paul Evans did not recognize. He kept his face neutral as he walked to the assigned spot for the human delegation. Their table was small and placed near the edge of the room. It was far from the center where the main leaders sat. The chairs were low, forcing them to look up at everyone else. It was a clear message. Humans were not equals here. They were guests who should be seen and not heard. Linda Moore sat down gracefully. She smoothed her blue suit and placed her datapad on the table. Jason Clark stood behind them, holding the briefcase. He looked around with wide eyes. He had never seen so many different types of life in one place. Paul sat next to Linda. He rested his hands on the table and watched the crowd. The other aliens talked among themselves. Their voices created a low hum that filled the hall. Some of them looked at the humans openly. A creature with blue skin and 4 eyes pointed at Paul. It said something to its neighbor, and they both laughed. Linda leaned toward a tall alien that looked like a bird. It had feathers of green and gold. She tried to start a conversation. She said hello and mentioned that she hoped for a good meeting. The bird alien turned its head away. It pretended not to hear her. Linda sat back slowly. Her face showed a hint of hurt, but she did not show anger. Paul saw this. He knew that this treatment was intentional. They wanted the humans to feel small. Suddenly, a bell sound rang through the room. It was sharp and clear. Every alien stopped talking. The room went quiet. Princess Vea walked to the center platform. She stood higher than everyone else. The light focused on her, making her silver skin shine. She looked out at the crowd with a proud expression. She began to speak. Her voice was amplified so that every corner of the hall could hear her. She talked about the history of the Galactic Council. She said they had brought peace for thousands of years. She said that before the Council, the galaxy was full of chaos and fire. Paul listened carefully. He noticed that she used the word peace many times. But she also used the word control. She explained that the Council protected the weak from the strong. She said that some species were not ready to handle weapons or power. She paused and looked directly at the human table. The room seemed to hold its breath. She said that aggression was a disease. She said that young species often caught this disease when they first reached the stars. She implied that humans were sick. She said the Council was the cure. The aliens in the room nodded in agreement. Some of them looked at Paul with pity. Others looked at him with fear. Linda Moore leaned closer to Paul. She whispered that this was not going well. She said they were being painted as villains before they could even speak. Paul nodded slightly. He did not take his eyes off the princess. He knew that words were weapons here. Vea was using them to weaken humanity's position. She wanted the Council to vote for restrictions on human ships. She wanted to limit where humans could travel. Paul thought about Earth. He thought about the history books. Humans had fought many battles. But they fought to survive. They did not fight to conquer. There was a difference. Vea did not understand this difference. Or maybe she did not care. The princess continued her speech. She listed the achievements of the Council. They built trade routes. They stopped pirates. They mapped the dark sectors of space. She said that humanity could benefit from all of this. But there was a condition. Humanity had to prove they were safe. They had to show they could follow rules. The crowd murmured again. It sounded like agreement. Paul felt the weight of the moment. If he said the wrong thing now, humanity would be trapped. They would be allowed in the Council, but only as servants. He looked at Jason. The young aide looked worried. Paul gave a small shake of his head. It was a signal to stay calm. Vea finished her speech. She spread her arms wide. She said that now was the time for questions. She said that any member could ask the new guests about their history. She smiled at Paul. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had cornered prey. She said she was very curious about human history. She said she heard stories about their past. She wanted to hear the truth from their own mouths. The room turned toward the human table. Hundreds of eyes focused on Paul and Linda. The silence was heavy. It felt like the air was too thick to breathe. Paul knew this was the trap. Vea was going to ask about their wars. She wanted him to admit that humans were violent. She wanted to shame him in front of everyone. Paul took a slow breath. He was ready to answer. He just hoped the galaxy was ready to hear it. The silence in the Great Hall stretched out for a long time. It felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on everyone. Princess Vea stood on her high platform and looked out at the crowd. She smiled again, but this time it was sharp and cold. She said that the floor was open for questions. She said that the council believed in transparency. She wanted the new members to be honest about their past. Her eyes moved across the room until they stopped at the human table. The light seemed to follow her gaze. It pinned Paul Evans in his seat. Paul felt the attention of hundreds of aliens. He did not move. He kept his hands on the table. Linda more shifted in her chair. She looked at Paul with worry in her eyes. She knew what was coming. The KRWL Empire had studied human history. They knew about the conflicts on Earth. They knew about the battles in space. Vea wanted to use this knowledge as a weapon. She wanted to make humanity look dangerous. Jason Clarke tightened his grip on the briefcase. His knuckles turned white. He looked at the exits, as if planning escape. Paul gave a small shake of his head. He told them without words to stay still. Princess Vea stepped down from her platform. Her robes flowed behind her like water. She walked across the smooth black floor. Her steps made no sound. The crowd parted to let her through. They watched her with interest. They wanted to see the human break. They wanted to see him apologize. Vea stopped right in front of Paul's table. She was much taller than him. She looked down with her silver eyes. She did not speak to Linda. She spoke only to Paul. She asked him if he was the military leader of the human delegation. Paul said yes. His voice was calm and steady. Vea nodded slowly. She said that military leaders usually had stories of violence. She said that peace was built by diplomats, not soldiers. She implied that Paul was in the wrong place. She said she was curious about the human record. She asked him how many wars his species had fought since they learned to fly among the stars. She spoke loudly so everyone could hear. Her voice echoed in the big room. The aliens leaned forward. Some of them smirked. They expected a low number. They expected him to say 5 or 10. They wanted to call him a barbarian. Paul looked up at her. He did not blink. He thought about the question. It was a trick. If he said a low number, she would call him a liar. If he said a high number, she would call him a monster. There was no safe answer unless he told the truth. The truth was hard to hear. Paul thought about the history of his people. He thought about the ships that never came home. He thought about the planets that were lost. He thought about the enemies that wanted them dead. He remembered the faces of the soldiers who served under him. He remembered the silence after the battles ended. Linda more leaned in close. She whispered that he did not have to answer. She said they could claim diplomatic immunity. She said they could skip the question. Paul shook his head slightly. He told her that hiding the truth was worse. He said that humans did not hide from their past. He said that shame was for those who did wrong without reason. Humans fought for survival. There was a difference. Linda sat back. She saw the resolve in his eyes. She knew he had made up his mind. She straightened her suit and prepared to support him. Jason Clarke looked nervous. He checked the datapad on the table. He was looking for protocol rules. He wanted to find a way to stop this. But there were no rules for this kind of insult. The council allowed the hosts to question the guests. It was tradition. Paul placed his hand on the table. He pushed his chair back slightly. The sound of the legs scraping the floor was loud in the quiet room. He stood up slowly. He was not as tall as the princess, but he stood straight. He looked like a solid rock in a storm. Princess Vea smiled wider. She thought she had won. She thought he was standing to surrender. She crossed her arms over her chest. She waited for him to speak. The room was completely still. No one whispered. No one moved. Even the air seemed to stop flowing. Paul looked at Vea, then he looked at the rest of the council. He saw the judgment in their faces. He saw the fear in some of them. He knew that his words would change everything. He took a deep breath. He filled his lungs with the strange air of the alien world. He was ready to speak. He was ready to tell them the real story of humanity. The moment hung in the air, waiting for the number that would shock them all. Paul Evans spoke the number clearly. He said 99. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the great hall without help from the microphones. The sound was flat and hard. It hit the walls and bounced back. For a second, nobody moved. Then Princess Vea laughed. It was a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. She looked at the other aliens and smiled. She thought this was the proof she needed. She thought this number showed that humans were violent and crazy. She opened her mouth to speak again, to mock him for the high number. But Paul did not sit down. He raised one hand. It was a simple gesture, but it stopped her. Paul began to speak again before the princess could say a word. He told them that the number was high, but the context mattered. He said that humanity did not fight for land or gold. He said they did not fight to conquer neighbors. He explained that every single one of those 99 wars was fought for survival. He said that in each case, an enemy came to human space with the goal of extinction. He said humans did not start the fights. They finished them. The room grew quieter. The aliens stopped whispering. They began to listen. Linda Moore sat very still. She watched Paul speak. She saw the strength in his posture. Jason Clark stopped looking at the exits. He stood tall behind the table. Paul continued his explanation. He listed some of the enemies they had faced. He spoke of rogue machines that wanted to delete all biological life. He spoke of raiders who burned planets for fun. He said the council knew about some of these threats. He said the council usually chose to hide behind barriers and ignore the problem. He said humanity chose to stand in the way. He looked directly at Princess Vea. He told her that humans did not have the luxury of peace. They had to build it with fire and steel. The princess stopped smiling. Her face became stiff. She did not like being corrected in front of her people. Then Paul talked about the last war. He said the 99th war was recent. He said it happened in this specific sector of space. He described a swarm of creatures that consumed stars. He said they were dark and endless. He said they moved like a shadow across the galaxy. He asked the room if anyone remembered the dark year. Some of the older aliens shifted in their seats. They remembered. The KRYLL Empire had closed their borders during that time. They had hidden their fleet. They had let the outer systems burn. Paul said that humanity had no place to hide. Earth was in the path of the swarm. So they fought. Paul said the human fleet was small compared to the swarm. He said they lost many ships. He said many good people died in the dark. But he said they pushed the swarm back. He said they broke the enemy will. He looked around the room at the wealthy diplomats. He told them that the reason the Great Hall was still standing was because of human blood. He said the peace they enjoyed was bought by human soldiers. He said the sector was safe now because humanity won the 99th war. The air in the room felt heavy. It was hard to breathe. The aliens looked at each other. They realized the truth. They were not judging a barbarian. They were judging a shield. Princess Vea took a step back. Her silver skin looked pale under the lights. She had no words to say. Her plan to shame the humans had failed. Instead, she had shamed her own people. She had claimed humans were unstable children. But Paul had shown that they were the adults in the room. They were the ones doing the hard work. The council members looked down at their tables. Some could not meet Paul's eyes. They felt shame. They had lived in comfort while humans fought in the dark. The laughter was gone. The smirks were gone. There was only silence. It was a deep and heavy silence. It was the sound of respect being born. Linda Moore let out a slow breath. She had been holding it for a long time. She looked at Paul with pride. She knew this was risky, but it was necessary. Jason Clarke loosened his grip on the briefcase. He looked around the room. The aliens were not looking at them with pity anymore. They were looking with fear and awe. Paul finally lowered his hand. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The truth was enough. He stood there in his simple green uniform. He looked like the only real thing in a room full of decorations. The princess opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had lost control of the room. The great hall remained silent, waiting for the next move. The power had shifted from the throne to the human table. The silence in the great hall lasted for a long minute. It felt like time had stopped. Then, an old alien stood up from the center seat. He was High Counselor Vex. His skin was gray and wrinkled, showing his age. He was the leader of the assembly. He looked at Princess Vea, then he looked at Paul Evans. He raised a hand to signal the end of the quiet. He said that the truth was often hard to hear. He said that the council had forgotten what true danger looked like. They had lived in comfort for too long. He thanked Commander Evans for his honesty. Princess Vea stepped forward. She looked angry. She tried to speak. She said that humans were still dangerous. She said that having so many wars made them unstable. High Counselor Vex turned to her. His voice was firm. He told her to be silent. He said that survival was not a crime. He said that hiding from danger was the real weakness. The princess closed her mouth. Her hands shook at her sides. She looked small for the first time. The other aliens watched her. Their respect for her was fading. They looked at Paul with new eyes. They saw a protector, not a threat. High Counselor Vex called for the vote. He asked if humanity should join the Galactic Council as full members. He added a new condition. He said humans should have a seat on the Defense Committee. This was a high honor. It meant they would help plan the security of the galaxy. Usually, only the oldest species got this role. The aliens began to vote. Lights on their desks turned green. One by one, the room filled with green light. There were no red lights. The vote was unanimous. Humanity was in. The crowd did not cheer. They stood up instead. It was a formal sign of respect. Paul Evans nodded to the counselor. He did not smile. He said that humanity did not want special honors. He said they would do their duty because it was right. He said they fought to protect their homes, and now they would help protect the galaxy. But he made it clear that humans would not be ordered around. They were partners, not servants. High Counselor Vex bowed his head. He accepted the terms. The meeting was over. The guards moved to open the large doors. Paul turned to leave. He signaled for Linda and Jason to follow. As they walked toward the exit, the crowd parted. In the beginning, the aliens had stared and whispered. Now, they stepped aside quietly. They made a path for the humans. Some of the dignitaries nodded as Paul passed. A few even placed their hands over their hearts. It was a gesture of peace and honor. Paul walked with his head high. He did not look at the princess. She stood alone near her platform. No one was standing near her anymore. She was left in the shadow of her own arrogance. Linda Moore walked beside Paul. She whispered that they had done it. She said she was proud of him. She said the way he spoke changed everything. Paul said it was not about him. It was about the people who fought before him. He said the number 99 represented lives lost. He said he spoke for them. Jason Clarke walked behind them. He held the briefcase loosely now. He looked relaxed. He smiled at a passing alien. The alien smiled back. The fear was gone. The hostility was gone. The USS Dakota waited for them outside. They walked out into the cool air of the capital planet. The white stone platform was quiet. The sky was dark with stars. The ship waited with its ramp down. The KRL guards stood at attention. This time, they saluted as the humans passed. Paul stopped at the bottom of the ramp. He looked back at the great hall. The lights were still shining inside. He knew the work was not done. Joining the council was just the beginning. There would be more threats. There would be more hard choices. But humanity would face them together. Paul walked up the ramp and into the ship. The airlock hissed shut behind them. The familiar smell of recycled air and metal welcomed them home. Linda took off her formal jacket. She sat down in the bridge chair. Jason began to pack away the datapads. Paul stood at the front window. He looked out at the planet below. It was beautiful, but he knew it was fragile. Peace was not a gift. It was something you had to keep safe. He touched the glass of the window. He thought about Earth. He thought about the next mission. The engines of the USS Dakota began to hum. The ship lifted off the platform. It moved smoothly into the black sky. The stars grew brighter as they left the atmosphere. Paul watched them appear. He felt calm. He knew the galaxy was vast and dangerous. But humanity was no longer alone. They had a voice now. They had a seat at the table. And if anyone forgot what humans were capable of, Paul knew he could remind them. He turned away from the window. He told the crew to set a course for home. The ship jumped into faster than light speed. The stars stretched into lines of light. They were going home, but they would be back. The galaxy knew their name now, and they would not forget it.